I was blown away that the first man to ever cross the Pacific was an Afro Portuguese man, a mulatto in the parlance of the day. I also learned that he had been secretly condemned to death. And I found that is quite fascinating, and it's quite revealing of the harsh dealings of that era of early exploration.
The story of how European explorers crossed the Atlantic has been well documented, but the push to discover a round-trip route across the Pacific from what is now Mexico to Asia is less well known. That is, until now. This is The Backdrop, a UC Davis podcast exploring the world of ideas. I'm Satirius Johnson. Acclaimed historian and UC Davis professor Andres Resendez has researched and written a riveting account of the first expedition to accomplish that, launching an era of global trade with the Far East. In Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner, and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery, he tells how it starts with a secret mission and includes a mutiny, a shipwreck, and an African Portuguese navigator whose story was almost lost to history. Andres, thanks for coming on to The Backdrop.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's start with why trying to find this round-trip route was so important.
Right. So basically, everybody knows that Magellan, in the course of his famous circumnavigation voyage, was the first European to go from the Americas to Asia in one swoop. And that is true. And in the aftermath of that pioneering voyage, the Spanish crown wanted to tap into the enormous riches of the Far East. And what it needed to do was to find a way to get back, once Spanish ships were in Asia, to find a way back to America, to start trading from its American colonies directly to Asia, and thus compete with Portugal, which at the time was the main rival and was trading directly with Asia, but by the long way around the world, around Africa, India, and into the Far East.
Right. And so the challenge was not so much going from the Americas to Asia, but finding that way to come back. That's what the hard part was.
Exactly. Because of the way the dominant winds and currents go right around the north-south, the latitude, the north-south distance of the coast of Mexico, it was a straight shot all the way to the Philippines with favorable currents and winds. But returning required finding out the whereabouts of the gyre, these enormous circle of winds and currents that rotates regularly in the North Pacific. And so it required them to go far north from the Philippines to around the level of what is now the northernmost islands in Japan, or the coast of Oregon, or even Washington State, and find that patch of the ocean, of the enormous Pacific Ocean, where the conditions were favorable for a return.
And the stakes were high, right? The stakes for this is almost like a space race back in the 1500s in a way, right? Spain versus Portugal, they're kind of rivals. And so there's economics involved, there's geopolitical, strategic issues involved.
Absolutely. I mean, these are two neighboring kingdoms, and the foremost maritime powers at the time. And basically, they divided the world between themselves, and they drew a line in the Atlantic from pole to pole. And so Portugal got everything that was to the right of the line. And by that, it got all the coast of Africa and everything to the right of that. So Africa, India, and Spain got the rest, which is everything to the left of the line, which was the rest of the Americas and the Pacific Ocean. And so Spain needed to find that practicable route back from the Pacific coast.
Right. So the Spanish king decides he wants to find a way to make it work. So how does the plan play out?
Well, first of all, I would say that in the aftermath of Magellan, the Spanish monarchy embarked on an all-out quest to try to find this elusive return, or vuelta, as it was called in Spanish. And so to that effect, they sent no less than 7 voyages, either from Spain or from the coast of the Americas, to try to do just that. And all those 7 voyages ended up in disaster. They were either vanquished by the enormous distances, or they were unable to return. They succumbed to attacks from native islanders in the Pacific Islands, etc. So this expedition that concerns us here was the 8th and the most elaborate, where money was no object for the Spanish crown. It involved the most accomplished pilots of the era. It involved building the largest ships ever built in the Americas up to that time. So no expenses spared. And as you pointed out in your fine introduction, Spain undertook all of these for 7 years, trying to keep it secret from Portugal in order to keep them in the dark about what they were doing.
So now we have this eighth attempt to do it. And how do they keep it secret from Portugal? And I guess it basically launches from the west coast of the Americas of what is now Mexico. Back then, I guess Spain called it New Spain. How did they try to accomplish this?
Two ways. First of all, the Spanish monarchy consulted only a few people. So the order came from the Spanish king directly. But the person in charge of actually putting together the venture was the king's representative in Mexico, the Viceroy of Mexico. And he was the one who consulted with different map makers and pilots and people who had sailed through the Pacific. And the king himself, we know, got angry at his viceroy for communicating the plan to so many people, because the king was very, very aware that word might leak to Portugal. So we know that. So they were trying to limit the number of people who knew about the secret voyage, number one. And number two, instead of departing out of Acapulco, which was the most established port in the western coast of Mexico, they decided to depart from a dilapidated harbor far to the north of Acapulco, named Navidad, or Christmas, which remains a teeny tiny tourist town in Mexico today, and that's where these gargantuan galleons were built, and people gathered in order to get ready for this extraordinary voyage.
It's pretty amazing. And so they put together these teams. How many ships do they send out, and who do they bring together to go on this expedition?
So the fleet consisted of 4 ships, 2 that were enormous. And just to give you a sense, Columbus's largest ship in the voyage of discovery was no more than 80 tons of burden. Or Magellan's largest ship was probably 120. The largest 2 here were 550 and over 400. So 3 or 4 times larger than the largest ships of discovery, just to give you a sense of the scope.
Wow.
And so 4 ships, 2 of them very large, 2 of them smaller, 80 tons and 40 tons. And of course, the problem was to find the best pilots possible. And that's where our crew comes into being. So the king, in collaboration with his viceroy, looked far and wide through the enormous, empire, and also even contracted pilots from abroad. There was a Frenchman, a mysterious Frenchman. There was a man probably of Venetian descent, as well as these Afro-Portuguese pilot who was passing as a Spaniard and had a very unlikely story and ended up being the protagonist of this voyage.
Yeah, so tell us about, you're speaking of Lope Martin. Tell us about his story. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. So Lope Martin, we know that he hailed from southern Portugal in a region that is now known as the Algarve, which at the time was probably the preeminent maritime region in the world. So that is where voyages of exploration from both Portugal and Spain departed from. And so we know that Lope Martin, as a youngster, as a 10-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy, must have cut his teeth aboard some of those ships, carrying sacks of flour or climbing up to the top of the mast, etc. We know that he's described as a free mulatto. That is, he was a man of color, and his parents had been, we don't know if his parents or grandparents or somebody, the forebears, must have been slaves, people from Western Africa, brought into the town of Lagos, which is where he was from. But he himself was a free man, but nonetheless a free man or a free boy, but in such dire situation that he was faced to go into the life of the sea, which was a very harsh, very uncertain, very difficult, risky life at the time. So that's the background of our hero. But what is really most extraordinary, what really caught my attention from the very beginning about this story, is that he persevered. He continued to climb through the ladder. Becoming a pilot at the time had become a very technical enterprise in the middle of the 16th century. It was called the art of navigation, and it had become less an art and more of a science because it required knowledge in mathematics, it required knowledge in cartography, and it required mastering a series of techniques in order to establish one's position in the middle of the ocean and without the sight of land, like measuring the angle of the sun with respect to the horizon at noontime to establish north-south distance or latitude, and using some declination tables. So anyways, the point is he passed the exams. You had to pass formal examinations, and he became a pilot, which was the highest post that somebody like Martin could ever aspire to. There were as you may know, most of the pilots and commanders at the time in the 16th century were white Europeans. And so it was only a few extraordinary people of color. Lope Martin was not the only one. There were some other pilots of color, but there were so few as to still stand out.
Right.
And he was able to break through that.
So
rank.
he overcame a lot of adversity. He kind of rises to the top of his field. He gets chosen to be. Is he one of the four navigators who one navigator each ship to go out on this expedition? Is that right?
There were 6 pilots. The idea was the original intention was to get 2 pilots per ship, because, as the Spanish authorities explained very tersely, one pilot may be missing in the course of this expedition, anticipating the enormous loss of life that they expected. But in spite of their best efforts, they could not secure 8 excellent pilots, only 6, and Martin was one of them.
Okay, so despite all this adversity, he rises to the top of his field. He gets chosen to be one of the pilots. And so give us the thumbnail sketch of how this expedition happens, how it plays out.
So the very bare minimum is that they depart from Navidad. The idea is to go straight to the Philippines to establish a Spanish outpost there. And then one of the ships would attempt their return, the elusive return voyage, presumably one of the 2 largest ships. But just merely 10 days after departing from Navidad, there is a storm, and the ship that is piloted by Martin, a ship called the San Lucas, loses sight of the other 3 ships that remain together. The San Lucas was by far the smallest of the 4 ships, and Martin was the only pilot aboard. As we said, some of the other ships had 2 pilots. This one only had Martin. And even though the idea was to go straight to the Philippines, they knew about a couple of islands on the way in Micronesia. And the plan was, because ships at that time did not have GPSs or did not have telecommunications. So should one of those get separated, then the idea was that they would go straight to one of these islands and wait for the rest of the fleet to catch up. And this is what Martin did, but it was extremely difficult to come together. And in fact, the separation became permanent all the way to the Philippines. And so what happened was the San Lucas made every effort to try to connect with the other 3 ships. They navigated through the middle of the Philippines, and they came close to actually establishing contact with the other 3, because they actually went to the place where the Spanish had been before, since the time of Magellan. However, they missed each other by a few days. And so the people aboard the San Lucas, Martin and the Spanish commander, the Spanish captain of the ship, faced the terrible situation of either continuing to search to try to find the other ships, but consume their dwindling provisions while doing that, or they could try to surrender to in the Spice Islands where the Portuguese had established some forts. So basically to give up and hope that the Portuguese would take them back to Europe by the long way, by way of India and Africa. or they could attempt the return by themselves, even though this was the smallest ship and a ship that was not supposed to be attempting the return. Instead, the idea was that one of the two largest ships would be attempting the return. And this is what they did.
Yeah. So how long were they there? How long were they kind of trying to connect with the other Spanish ships, and until they decided, okay, let's take the next step?
They stopped for a month to make repairs in the southernmost island of the Philippines, Mindanao, waiting to see if the other ships would show up. And then they sailed for 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, right through the middle of the archipelago, looking for the other ships, and they couldn't find it. So close to 2 months they were
Wow.
looking for the other ships.
So they're faced with a decision. Okay, our supplies are dwindling. Are we just going to stay here? Are we going to try to go back home the other way, the normal way? Or are we going to try to go back, trying to find this Vuelta, this return trip over the Pacific? And they decide they're gonna go for it. They're gonna try to head back over the Pacific.
Exactly. It was a decision that was a little bit forced on them, because by the time they reached the end of the archipelago, it was a time when there was very strong currents, and the currents were taking them away from the land. And so we have a remarkable document that where the captain asks the pilot, asks Lope Martin, so we need to decide what we're going to do, whether we are going to go to the Spice Islands and surrender to the Portuguese, or should we try the Vuelta? And we have the actual words of Lope Martin saying that I think we should try the Vuelta because of certain. We know that he solved the riddle of how to navigate. Part of the problem was that, Martin knew that they needed to go way north in order to catch the other side of the gyre, as we were explaining, this vast circle of currents and winds. But he also was aware of a second key, which was this is all happening in the spring, and this region is still dominated by the monsoon. So there is a 180-degree change in the direction of the winds and the currents in this part of the world. And so in the early spring, there is a shift that is favorable to them. And he and Lope Martin clearly understood that this is the best time for us to try to make headway. And if we can go north enough, he says that we will find favorable winds and currents that will take us back home. And so he's able to persuade the captain to attempt this crazy thing on a souped up boat with basically 8 casks of water that are not full to the top, and with very minimal amounts of food for a voyage of this scope.
That's incredible. And so he was able to kind of bring together information that the 7 failed previous attempts. How did these other ships never made it back? So how was he able to learn from their mistakes?
That's a very speculative and difficult question to answer for sure. One possibility is that he may have learned about these seasonal shift in the winds from local navigators. We know that they came in contact with Filipino navigators who would have been well versed in this. That is one possibility. The other possibility is that he had talked to European navigators at the start of the expedition in Navidad, or perhaps in Mexico City. We know that the guiding spirit of this whole fleet was another no less extraordinary individual. He was a cosmographer who had been apprenticed to some of the survivors of Magellan's expedition, and he had participated 4 decades earlier in another life or death expedition across the Pacific. And, it had not succeeded. He had remained stranded in Southeast Asia for 8 years, but he survived. And during those 8 years, he would have learned about the seasonal pattern of the winds and the currents. And 4 decades later, he was recruited for this elite expedition. And so obviously it's quite conceivable that he may have talked to the other pilots in the fleet, and he may have imparted some of his information that Martin already knew even before arriving to the Philippines.
Right. Okay. So they decide, like, we're going to go for it. We're going to try to go back. And so what happens next?
So they They go north. Their initial idea was that they would try to hit Japan, and they couldn't do it. The currents and the winds were such that it took the San Lucas into the immensity of the Pacific rather than a straight up climb that would have taken them to Japan. Then they tried to find the coast of China, but they were still navigating too far, too deep into the ocean to do that. And so they had no other recourse but to try to continue on until hitting the coast of the Americas. But they suffered enormously during the passage. They were basically sailing some 10 degrees of latitude to the south of the Aleutian Islands, which is this necklace of islands between Russia and Alaska. So they experienced the coldest summer ever. So they describe how they were from the tropical environment in the Philippines. And in fact, they had lost nearly all their clothes because at one stop, they had tried to wash their clothes, and the party that was washing the clothes was suddenly attacked by islanders, and they had to abandon the clothes and run for their lives. And so they had very few clothes on them. So they were extremely exposed to the elements at that point. So that was one major problem, the cold. But perhaps the worst and somewhat unexpected is that there was a plague of rats aboard the ship. And the only water available aboard the ship was in these 8 casks of water. And only 5 of them contained water at the time. They only were sailing with 5 casks of water. And so what the rats did was they started gnawing on some of the casks in order to get access to the water. And at one point, they spilled the contents of 2 of the casks, 2 of the 5 remaining casks, by way of gnawing them. And so the crew members had to post a 4-man guard 24 hours, day and night. They had to light fires at night in order to guard the casks, and they kept killing 10, 20, 15 rats, desperately trying to attack the casks in order to get access to the only water available.
Unbelievable, because that you're talking life and death there. Like they wouldn't survive if they can't protect that water.
Absolutely. I mean, at that point, the amount of water per person was incredibly low. And of course, they didn't know exactly how long the voyage would last. And in fact, getting back to America takes longer. Just to give you a sense, typically going from the Americas, from the coast of Mexico to Philippines, it would take 3 months, sometimes 4 months. Getting back usually took longer. It could take up to 6 or 7 months. In this case, it just took almost 4 months. But still, they didn't know at the time, because this was the first time it was ever done. They didn't know how long that would take.
Right. That's incredible. So it takes them all those many months to get back. They do get back. Where do they end up landing? Do they end up landing back at Navidad?
They did. They reached back at Navidad after a near shipwreck. They basically limped along. They had severe signs of scurvy, lack of vitamin C, but they were received like heroes. They were hailed as heroes, the beginning of a new era in which Mexico would become the crossroads between East and West. It would start this trade with Asia, all these precious spices, all these Chinese porcelain and Chinese silk, etc. So they were celebrated. But 2 months later, the flagship in the expedition also returned, unbeknown to all of this. And representatives from the fleet commander had remained in the Philippines to establish these Spanish outposts, as we had said at the beginning, accusing Lope Martin and the captain of the San Lucas of abandoning the expedition when the weather was good and for no good reason. So basically accusing them of treason. And so what had been a great celebration just 2 months earlier turned into a judicial proceeding, which is how we know about many of the details of this whole expedition to begin with.
And so he goes from becoming a hero to becoming kind of a criminal. What happens to him?
He is repeatedly tried and he's acquitted of this charge. But nonetheless, he is required to become the lead pilot of a follow up expedition to the Philippines in order to resupply the Spanish base that they had established in the Philippines. And this was a way to acquit him, but also to punish him, because the pilot knew full well that the moment he set foot in the Philippines, the fleet commander in the Philippines would hang him for abandoning, because that was the charge to begin with. So here we have this incredible pilot who had risen through the ranks, who had been the first to learn to sail the Pacific, basically to go there and return successfully, thus opening, so to speak, the Pacific in the same way that Columbus had opened the Atlantic with his pioneering voyage of 1492. This was the same accomplishment, except that he was tainted and he was basically repaid in this way. And moreover, this follow-up expedition would have a notary that would be carrying a sealed envelope in which there was a letter telling the commander in the Philippines that Lope Martin should be hanged as a repayment for his services.
Unbelievable. So does Martin actually go through with this trip? I mean, he didn't know that they had that letter, but he kind of assumed, it wouldn't come to a good end.
He did know the contents of the sealed envelope were leaked, and he learned about this. So here you have a pilot who had no reason to reach his destination, but somehow, instead of thinking of this as a death sentence, he increasingly viewed this voyage as an opportunity. So he basically was given, in order to induce him to become the lead pilot, he was allowed to choose his own crew. And so he chose allies, some of them Portuguese also, or of Portuguese ancestries. And he was given considerable power aboard the ship. So what we have is a follow-up expedition in which Lope Martin somehow believed that he could persuade the captain of this follow-up expedition. And in fact, he said, look, they're going to kill me if I go there, but I can take you anywhere. I can take you to the coast of China. I could take you to the Spice Islands. I could bring you back through the Strait of Magellan. You could become an incredibly wealthy individual. And this is something that must have crossed his mind, because having a pilot of the caliber of Lope Martin and having a well-supplied ship could really turn a small group of men into incredibly wealthy individuals in just one voyage.
So is that what they did? I mean, did they just abscond with the ship and went on their own way?
No. So basically, the captain was a gruff Spaniard of very few words, and it became very clear to Martin that he was going to follow through with the original plan. And so Martin's only recourse was to get rid of him. And so he instigated a mutiny that resulted in the loss of life of this captain. Then there was a follow-up mutiny. It's a very complicated story. A follow-up mutiny, and in the end, this one ship, this follow-up expedition consisted of one ship, ended up stranded in Micronesia, in one atoll in Micronesia, Ujalang, where after a mutiny and a counter mutiny, Lope Martin and 26 of his closest allies remained stranded while the rest of the ship continued on to the Philippines.
So how does the story of Lope Martin end? I mean, so he gets stranded on this atoll. Does he live the rest of his life basically there or in the area? What happens to him?
Well, the trail goes cold after this, but I have some indirect information from subsequent expeditions. A subsequent expedition claims that they found evidence of Martin and his men being in a different island, because they found some European artifacts in that island. Let's put this into context. We're talking about 26 sailors who are really well experienced. They are in possession of plenty of water, plenty of food, firearms. And we also know that there was an abandoned Polynesian or Micronesian vessel in this atoll that they had found. We know that from the sources. So it is quite possible that these 27 mariners were able to make a living there or move to a different island and made themselves at home, which I want to believe is a more fitting ending to the man who was the first to learn how to sail the Pacific and was so unfairly accused of betraying the Spanish crown and was sentenced to die there so unfairly. So these indirect evidence suggests that he made a living in his chosen element, and he may have lived there for many years.
I mean, it's a fascinating story. Why do you think the story of Lope Martin was, I mean, it seems like it was almost buried, almost lost to history. I mean, Columbus, everybody knows about Columbus, but very few people have heard of him. Why do you think that is?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, the accomplishment of Martin and this fleet that found the Vuelta, the return voyage, was less an accomplishment of conquering lands or new kingdoms as it was an accomplishment in knowledge. It was the connectedness of the 5 continents for the first time in history. It was the ability to go and come through the largest ocean on Earth. So that's a more intangible accomplishment. So that's one reason, I think. But the second reason, of course, has to do with the controversial circumstances in which Lope Martin made this incredible discovery. After all, he was accused of treason, and many historians ever since have deemed Lope Martin as piratical, as a troublemaker. And so that's one of the reasons, that's a very powerful reason why we have lost his name to history. The credit normally goes to this other, no less extraordinary mariner, the Andrés de Urdaneta, the leader of the fleet that arrived 2 months later. He was nonetheless second. The first one was Lope Martin. And so that's what I try to do in my book, is try to undo these historical injustices.
Right. I'm curious what led you to researching this story in the first place. Was it something that you had heard about maybe, as a child and wanted to see if it was true, or were you doing research on another book that led you to this story?
Yes, I was doing research on another book, and serendipitously I found a little snippets of this story. I was blown away that the first man to ever cross the Pacific was an Afro-Portuguese man, a mulatto, in the parlance of the day. I also learned that he had been secretly condemned to death, and I found that is quite fascinating, and it's quite revealing of the harsh dealings of that era of early exploration. And so I knew that at some point down the line, I would have to get to the bottom of this story. And that's the product, this book that just came out a couple of months ago.
How difficult was it to find source material to kind of piece it all together? I mean, how long did it take, and where did it take you? Did you have to go to Spain and to the Philippines? I mean, it sounds like it's a kind of a daunting task.
It is. It was fun, daunting but fun. I mean, I did have to go to Spain and to the Philippines and to Guam, to Mexico, and various parts in the United States to put it all together. It took me about 7 years. Maybe the hardest part about this was finding enough information. I mean, this is a man of humble origins, and so finding information about such individuals in the 16th century is extremely difficult. So that was one problem. But the other problem was providing the context. The story really comes alive if you understand the stakes, just how difficult it is to conquer the Pacific. It was in the 16th century like going to the moon, and just how extraordinary these individuals were. And so a great deal of the problem was about just providing the necessary context in order to understand the extraordinary story that was unfolding here.
Your research focus is European exploration and colonization of the Americas and the pioneering voyages across the Pacific, among other things. What drew you to that field?
I guess it's a common path for historians. I always tend to go further back, the more I get into my career. So I started out writing about the 19th century, but then you start wondering, okay, but how do we get here? So I jump back all the way to the 16th century, and that's what I've been writing in the last few years. but I didn't start out as a 16th century person. I find these stories of early contact between Europeans and Native Americans quite fascinating, and that era I find the grandest era for good and bad. I mean, it was the grandest era of slavery, the grandest era of discovery, of incredible scientific attainment, and also incredible savagery.
Mm-hmm. I think I read someplace that you sail as well, so you it seems like you must appreciate what these sailors went through.
Right. I mean, so I have a small sailboat and I sail in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so I learned very quickly that you can run into trouble very quickly, and conditions are so variable. So I could only imagine what a voyage of this scope would have entailed. Not knowing what you're going to face, etc. So I think my experience as a sailor kept me in good stead in the writing of this book and was absolutely essential. I think I would have written a very different book had I not known a little bit about sailing myself.
Right. Well, this has been really great. I feel like some Hollywood director might be knocking on your door sometime soon to turn this story of Lope Martin into a feature film. I mean, it has all the makings of a great story, and it actually really happened.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I hope you are right.
Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Andres Resendez is professor of history at UC Davis and author of Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery. His previous book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the 2017 Bancroft Prize. You can find out more about his work on our website, ucdavis.edu/podcast. And if you like the backdrop, check out our other UC Davis podcast, Unfold. It breaks down complicated problems and unfolds curiosity-driven research, like why songs get stuck in your head, or what real-world engineering concepts you can learn from comic books. Join public radio veteran and host Amy Quinton and co-host Kat Kurland for Unfold. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is The Backdrop, a UC Davis podcast exploring the world of ideas.